Hello and welcome to another review of a film that I've seen on Mubi. This time I'm reviewing the film About Endlessness from 2019, directed by Roy Andersson. I very much enjoyed this film. I'd only seen one Roy Andersson film before, which was Pigeon Sat on a Branch Reflecting on Existence, which I really loved that film. I mean, the title alone is amazing. I liked it before I even started watching it. But I really enjoyed that film, and so I was very much looking forward to this one. And it doesn't disappoint in the sense of what you expect from a Roy Andersson film, the kind of grey brown palette, the kind of series of short stories that aren't related explicitly, but you can find links between them. The kind of half reality, the maybe it's like the characters are almost half living, half dead. It's very non-realist. It's the sets are kind of sterile. The actors underplay everything. He's a unique filmmaker, and there's a unique kind of aesthetic and style to it. Both films, Pigeon and About Endlessness, are full of sadness and kind of existentialist angst, and in a really interesting way, quite emotional films to watch, even though at some level the characters don't seem to display much emotion. I think that Anderson hinted that this might be his last film, and it does kind of feel like a goodbye. It almost has a feeling of kind of waiting for death. I think perhaps both Pigeon and this film have that feeling actually, but there is a kind of sad goodbye feeling to this film, which that makes it interesting. I think the thing that really makes his films unique is not just the kind of minimalist aesthetic and the kind of sadness and the angst, because the way he uses music in this film and in Pigeon is, in this film I found the music quite moving at times, quite emotional. The aesthetic of the film and the what's happening is very kind of cold and cool and almost emotionless, but there's a warmth introduced by the music, especially the scene of the couple floating through the air, which we see at the beginning and we see kind of midway through the film. I found that a really kind of moving scene. There is a sadness to it. There is something sad, but so I think it's really interesting how Anderson uses music as a kind of counterpoint to the pessimism of the film. We see this in Pigeon as well because, he also uses slightly comedic music to contrast with, the darker subjects of the film. But, I think in some ways the characters in the film, he's not using what happens in the film to manipulate our emotions as viewers, but the music does manipulate a kind of mood around the film, which runs counter to actually what you're seeing in the film, and I think that's interesting. What I did do was I missed this when it came out last year, but there's a documentary called Being a Human Person on the making of this film, and I watched that after seeing this film, and it's a really interesting watch actually. Obviously that's not on Mubi. I had to rent that off a streaming service, but it was well worth watching, not least because it kind of follows the process of making this film, and it's really interesting in terms of seeing how the sets are built, because every single scene is filmed in the studio. I hadn't quite realised that before. Every single scene is created inside the studio, even the trains and station scenes, and it's quite interesting to see how it's done, because some of it is done with a trick of the eye, because many of the scenes, there's a scene in a station in About Endlessness where it looks very deep, but it almost looks like a painted set, and your eyes are kind of drawn at the back thinking, oh, that's a painted set, and then we see a person walking far away in the distance, and it's really clever because it's not realistic. It is a kind of synthetic, manufactured environment, but it kind of works. It's really clever, and the documentary shows how that's done. In fact, there's an interesting, if you don't want to pay to see the documentary, if you Google how to build a beach on a soundstage, there's a 5-minute film showing how they created the beach scene from About Endlessness in the studio. So all of that's very impressive and interesting. On the whole, I would say I didn't enjoy it as much as Pigeon Sat on a Branch Reflecting on Existence. In terms of the different stories, Pigeon felt like it was more coherent. It kind of felt like it had themes and characters that ran through it. About Endlessness feels more disconnected. It feels more like separate stories that, at the end do add up to something, but it doesn't quite feel as coherent as Pigeon. I think Pigeon also has a lot more ambiguity and surrealism than this film. I found at times About Endlessness was quite literal, and I'm not sure what I think about the scene between the young man and the young woman talking about energy and infinity and endlessness. It feels a little bit too literal. It feels like that is the critical conversation of understanding what the whole film is about. And I think that Pigeon is just a little bit less obvious. It's about at least as much as About Endlessness, probably more actually, but it's more subtle. It's more ambiguous. It leaves you more uncertain, but in a really good way. And I think also Pigeon, although it was very dark, and there's some really dark things in Pigeon, I just took a quick look at it again and kind of flicked through it, and there's a scene with a monkey in a lab being experimented on, and it's horrible but amazing as well. It's kind of the disdain that the person in the lab worker has for this kind of monkey that's being tortured, and it's so there's a lot of darkness in Pigeon, but there's also a lot of comedy, and I think this About Endlessness had a lot less comedy, and there's a kind of black comedy in everything Andersson does. I think it does make you smile sometimes, how underplayed it is and how straight it all is. But I think that, some of the scenes in Pigeon were much more comedic alongside being dark. I do want to see more Roy Andersson films. I mean, I think Songs from the Second Floor and You, the Living, both look really interesting. I watched the trailers for those, and so I do want to catch up on them. I do wonder if you watch all of his films, whether they're a little bit too similar. The things that make a Roy Andersson film that I described earlier, they all seem to have that to a greater or lesser extent. And I do just wonder if they're a little bit too samey. If you've seen any of the other films, let me know in the comments below. I'd be interested to see what you think. So, in summary, I liked this film and I would recommend it. Roy Andersson's a unique filmmaker, and his films, the two I've seen, have been really enjoyable. And I think after this film ended, there is something quite moving about it. I did feel moved, and yeah, that's quite interesting. So that's what I thought of about Endlessness. Next, I'll be reviewing New Order, directed by Michel Franco. So see you next time.